Well, everyone, it's Shane Kanto, your Wasteland reviewer, and welcome to Wasteland Talks, my weekly talk show where I talk about whatever the hell I want. And this is a solo episode as I have wrapped up my time taking a deep dive into the filmography of John Carpenter, and it's time for ranking. And I'm going to be ranking my order of all of John Carpenter's films, all 20 of them that I watched, and we're going to see how things turn out and how we rank them. And let's get started at number 20, which by far is at the bottom, is The Ward, which is also his last film. There just didn't seem to be much of any John Carpenter left, and just felt like this film had no particular reason why you should watch it. At least every other film on this list has something that's worth watching, digging into, having fun with. This movie has no fun. It is dull. It is boring. It feels so long, but it's only an hour and 28 minutes. The acting is not strong. Amber Heard is a shaky lead. Jared Harris tries his best. And there's so much suspension of disbelief, and what this film turns out to be is so ridiculous and over the top and just out there. And it leads all the way up to a horrible, obnoxious horror movie ending that's just not worth it. My number 19 is Village of the Damned, and this is a remake of a classic horror film from like the 1960s, if I'm not mistaken, and based off of a pretty famous book. And this film has the creepy kids. It has that. It has Christopher Reeves, who I think does a really fine job in this film. It has really interesting ideas. It just doesn't know what to do with them, and it kind of leaves some really big ideas on the ground. Like, it does not even tackle the idea that all these women in this town were violated and forcibly pregnated, and doesn't really tackle that in any way. The kids are creepy, and there's some definitely moments of tension and Carpenter showing what he does best in terms of a director. It just, so much of it doesn't click and never really comes together as a cohesive film. It just kind of leaves you wanting so much more, and it's pretty frustrating. My number 18 is his TV film biopic about Elvis, called Elvis. And there are very, 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 very brief glimpses at John Carpenter as a director in this film. And like there's a couple of POV shots where like, oh, there's Carpenter. But basically this is an overlong 2.5-hour biopic where really Elvis is just painted as a mama's boy and has a weird relationship with his mom. But Kurt Russell, I think, brings a lot of charisma. I really enjoy him here in this film. It is weird, like, having him singing and stuff, and it's obviously not his voice. But this film is so paint-by-the-numbers biopic that it's not particularly interesting or particularly worth taking 2.5 hours to dive into. At least Baz Luhrmann's film has a lot more personality and excitement. At number 17 is Memoirs of an Invisible Man, and this is so frustrating in where this kind of lands because there's so much potential here. Like, the special effects are incredible. There's some really impressive things that Carpenter is able to do with the Invisible Man concept and what it's doing with that. And those elements are exciting and cool to see come to life on screen. Sam Neill is a menacing antagonist. Chevy Chase is doing fine, I guess, doing his Chevy Chase kind of thing. But the whole entire film really leans on this romance between him and Daryl Hannah that just feels so no chemistry, no nothing, just dull. And there's a whole entire chunk of this film that leans so heavily into it. It just feels so unengaging that there's some really cool things and there's also some really big negatives. My number 16 on this list is Ghosts of Mars, and this movie is dumb. This movie doesn't have an ending. It runs into like, it feels like we're trying to go into the climax of the film and they don't have the budget for it. So they're like, well, that'll just be a sequel. and it just drops. But it has a lot of Carpenter's personality. When the action and the thrills and the tension building come, it really works. It's what Carpenter does best. And the music, his score with this is, he got crazy talented guitars like Buckethead and Scott Ian and Steve Vai. The music is intense. The visuals, it looks very like we're on Mars. It feels very tangible. The action moments are really crazy over the top. Just the acting and the characters are so bland and uninteresting that it doesn't really come together and doesn't add up to much. At number 15 is Escape from L.A. Escape from New York is so amazing. This movie just pales in comparison. And I've spent so many years at this point being like, but what if Escape New York had a bigger budget? And then you see this and you're just like, oh, could have been that. The special effects look so horrible in the mid-90s, and they lean so heavily on them. Because it's like we want to make this bigger and crazier. But the idea, the concept, the world that we live in, this alt-right, like fascist religious regime that's like isolating people in LA, which is now like a separate island because a bunch of California is under the water. Cool idea. Kurt Russell, still great. Just not everything comes together, and this feels like a pale comparison to Escape from New York. Number 14, which is Vampires. And this is the last one that I'm just like, I don't think it was a good film, but there's still elements to it. I think this is the closest one to being like, okay. The only challenging thing is the main characters of this film are so unlikable and horrible, it's hard to really invest in them. But the idea of these paid-for vampire hunters is such a cool idea. The vampire look are aggressive, metal kind of vampires, and they're not gothic and brooding. They're just... You have Terry Silver from Karate Kid and Cobra Kai as this vampire, and James Woods is so biting and venomous as our lead character. But when the action happens and the vampire hunting ensues, this is intense and awesome. It's just, there's a lot of elements that just don't come together that kind of pull this one down. At number 13, we have John Carpenter's own student film, Captain Voyer. And this is it's a short film. It's only like 7 or 8 minutes. And it's so perfect in capturing what John Carpenter's going to be in the future, because he's doing all of these elements of this voyeuristic camera work. And it's so engaging and interesting to watch, especially from like a student film. And, you know, it's about this voyeuristic guy who's just creeping through people's windows, and you see them doing all the weirdest stuff. And, spoiler alert, doesn't end well for him when he gets shot by one of them because he's being a creep. And it's such an interesting little film that shows so much great technical prowess that you're going to see Carpenter have in the future. And I think it's just an interesting look at a great creator before he really finds his stride, and I think that's interesting. Number 12 is Dark Star, which is his first feature film, which is this absurd, dark comedy in space that's part like workplace comedy because it's a bunch of guys stuck on a spaceship going through space, not getting along with each other, bickering and bantering all back and forth. And then you have little elements of, like, there's aliens. There's one that looks like a giant tomato, which is just a red colored beach ball. And you have all these crazy funny moments with that. And you have, like, this country music in space. It feels like a strange workplace comedy space western. And, you know, there's so many elements of it that are there, and it kind of splashes together. And it's so much fun seeing like this early special effects, but it's such an engaging and ridiculous time that I just had a decent amount of fun with it, and it definitely showed a lot of promise. Now, at number 11, I have Assault on Precinct 13, which is his follow-up, this 70s exploitation film, this action thriller of this idea of like these horrible criminal gang winds up like killing a young girl in an ice cream truck and everything, are chasing after this man who runs into a precinct that's being shut down that night. And then the police and the prisoners in this precinct have to team up to stop this invasion of this gang. And, it feels a little stretched thin at times. It feels like it's overdrawing its concept at times, but it's so visceral and intense and so very 70s, and dealing with these ideas of police and incarceration, stuff like that. It's a pretty inspired film that, has been remade, but not as good as this one. At number 10 is Prince of Darkness, and this was a first time watch for me on my journey through all of Carpenter's films, but this is this dark supernatural horror film. Also, it kind of has the feel of Assault on Precinct 13, except horror version, where you have this group of people in this ministry, this church, being invaded by this dark, ominous spirit and entities that are taking over human beings, making them eat like bugs and all kinds of crazy stuff. And you have like these religious figures played by Donald Pleasance, and it just has great visuals. It's an intense and unnerving film, and it just has so much life and horror elements in it that really showed where John Carpenter was at his peak, and this was a really great hidden gem. Next up at number 9 is Christine, adapted from the Stephen King novel of the same name. John Carpenter takes on this horror idea of what if a car was living and jealous and would kill people if you got in the way of its connection to its owner. And Christine itself is the best character in this film. This car straight up mutilates and just demolishes people left and right. And it's such an interesting idea, this high concept horror film. It definitely trims back a lot of the character work and changes what's going on inside the car from the book, but the characters aren't particularly interesting, but Christine keeps you in there, and there's really great direction and horror, and those elements keep this film afloat, even if some of the other elements aren't as strong. At number 8, we have In the Mouth of Madness, and this Lovecraftian, Stephen King inspired meta horror film by John Carpenter from the very early 90s, starring Sam Neill as this insurance investigator trying to find this novelist in this small town. And when he gets there, there's something so demonic and crazy going on. And where we see this descent that Sam Neill goes on is fascinating. And the imagery of it all is fascinating. What he does with like drawing all these crosses all over him, and him realizing like, is he in the movie about what is going on here? And how this film ends is crazy, and the score from John Carpenter is awesome. It's dark, it's ominous. You have the likes of like Charlton Heston in supporting roles in this film. There's so much intense and otherworldly imagery that just sells it. At number 7 is The Fog, and this is such a great film. This is a great horror film that expertly creates tension and utilizing the fog and these ghost pirates that you never really, very rarely see what they actually look like, because you don't have to. Their silhouettes, their specters in the fog are terrifying enough, knocking at doors and all kinds of things. And there's plenty of interesting and fun characters in this small fishing town, this coastal town that we see. You have the likes of Jamie Lee Curtis and her mother, Janet Leigh, and everybody else that brings this town together. Hal Holbrook, of all people, a priest, and there's this crazy curse on this town, and just the horror elements alone and the camera work and the direction are peak Carpenter, and it works so impressively well. We have at number 6, Starman, which is one of the biggest studio films that Carpenter ever did, and so interesting as this is at the heart of it a romance between a woman, Karen Allen, who we see at the beginning very emotional and raw, and Allen's giving an amazing performance. Her husband has died, and this alien lands on her planet and takes the image of her husband through this crazy body horror elements, and it's Jeff Bridges who gave an Oscar-nominated performance as this alien, doing all these weird mannerisms and everything, and you see them develop this connection throughout this film, and there's some genuine connection here. It's this road trip movie with these awesome sci-fi elements all thrown in. You have the government chasing them, they're trying to get to the spaceship. We've seen this story, but not quite done like this, and it's an interesting entry from Carpenter. Now we're at the cream of the crop, the top 5, and these are like his iconic films. And first we have Escape from New York, Kurt Russell, Snake Plissken, and him going into New York City, which is now a penal colony, and the President of the United States has crash landed there, and he needs to stop everybody, including the Duke, played by Isaac Hayes, from trying to get the president. And you have the likes of Harry Dean Stanton as Ernest Borgnine, and so many great character actors who fill out this cast. You have Lee Van Cleef. What are you doing, Bliskin? There, Donald Pleasance playing the President of the United States. This is such a cool world that's brought to life and has such a great score. The top 5 here have some of the best scores that you've heard, and Carpenter just doing his best work. And this is a thrilling, crazy, dystopian action thrill ride that had a limited budget, but made the most of it. At number 4, which this is such a fun, crazy, over-the-top martial arts fantasy film, and that is Big Trouble in Little China. And at the core of it, you have Jack Burton, Kurt Russell, who's a swaggering American hero who's a complete dumbass, and actually this film is a wonderful send-up of the white hero journey and the Asian sidekick, when in reality this story really is about his best buddy here who owes him some money, and he's trying to get his girl back, and he's the competent one. And there's plenty of fun martial arts here. There's fun performances from Russell and James Hong, who plays our evil spirit, who's just fantastic, and his elemental antagonist, his henchmen, and some of them have some of the most absurd deaths I've ever seen in a movie. But this is so much fun. It's so absurd, over the top, and great practical effects. Number 3 is They Live, Rowdy Roddy Piper, Keith David, in a back alley brawl to end all back alley brawls in film. That fight scene alone is so worth the price of admission. But obey. This is your God now. Procreate. Consume. And the world that we see through these sunglasses, and what's really going on when we're awakened to the reality of we've been invaded by aliens who are trying to make us all complacent in this capitalist machine that's keeping us oppressed. And the only one who can save us is John Nada, played by Rowdy Roddy Piper. And he's here to chew bubblegum and kick ass. And he's all out of bubblegum. And just to let you know, this film is so great with its layers. Did it put her out towards the end because probably lack of budget? Yeah, but this is still such an iconic film. But it is these two at the top that are masterpieces of cinema, and at number 2 is the slasher film, Halloween. Michael Myers is one of the most incredible embodiments of pure evil ever put to film. The voyeuristic camera work of this shape haunting us from the opening scene as we watch a murder through a mask on Halloween. Jamie Lee Curtis is so fantastic, and Donald Pleasance as Dr. Loomis as this crazed man trying to stop at nothing to stop evil. There's a lack of gore because there's craftsmanship and incredible filmmaking that build tension, build suspense. Some of the most terrifying moments are in broad daylight because it's the music, the score, the Halloween theme, the shape lurks. Those elements all come together to perfection. But for me, there could only be one at the top, which is my second favorite horror film of all time, and that is The Thing. And this film is a remake of a 50s style sci-fi horror flick, except this time it's replaced by some of the most amazing, elaborate, and complex practical effects ever put to film. And the voyeuristic camera work, the building of tension, the straight paranoia that's building at every single moment, the Ennio Morricone score that's channeling Carpenter at its best, and this fantastic ensemble including Kurt Russell and Keith David, and Wilford Brimley himself, with no mustache, really comes together, and you never know, especially on first watch, who's the thing and who isn't. It's that paranoia that builds and builds and builds and leads to one of the best ambiguous endings in the history of film. And that's it. That is my ranking of all 20 films that I watched for John Carpenter for Welcome to the Wasteland. If you haven't seen all of these films, at least over half of them are things that I'd highly recommend, and 19 out of 20 I feel like have some merit to them. Sorry, The Ward. But in general, John Carpenter, doubt that he'll ever direct another feature film, but he's still making scores and still being a great personality in terms of film. And he is such a talented genre filmmaker. And if you want to hear about why he's one of the all-time greats, check out my episode of Wasteland Talks with my brother Ethan as we discuss the reasons why. But here's my rankings of his films, and comment. Let me know what you think. Share what are some of your favorites. What are those films at the top for you? But thank you as always for tuning in and supporting your Wasteland Reviewer.